have the pleasure to hear a Dvar Torah this morning from Rabbi Jessica Lenza.
Shabbat Shalom. After the heartbreaking spiritual journey leading up to Tisha B'Av, we welcome the solace and the rest on this Shabbat of comfort, Shabbat Nachamu. For weeks, we have endured rebuke after rebuke from our prophets, decrying our sinful behavior and warning of the fast approaching, devastating repercussions we will suffer as the result of our insubordination. But today, we are finally granted with reprieve and consolation in our grief. We read in our Haftorah that God is like a loving shepherd who gently cradles their precious lambs in their bosom, protecting and guiding them through the dangerous wilderness. This love is powerful enough to cut through the anguish we feel and to surround ourselves with the safety we need to begin to heal. And that's the thing about love. Sometimes we trivialize it or diminish the psychological and physiological need for it, but love is more than what can be summarized on a greeting card. Love is a powerful force that has a profound impact on ourselves and shapes the world around us. And there is a rabbi that I think understood this more than most. From it, he would derive his legendary, enduring teachings. Of course, I am referring to the great Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva lived about 2,000 years ago, but I've always felt like he was one of my personal teachers. It is impossible to overstate the profound effect Rabbi Akiva had on Judaism. In the rabbinic mind, Akiva surpasses even Moshe in his deep understanding of Torah. He was a devoted and beloved teacher, amassing tens of thousands of students during a time when openly practicing Judaism was a dangerous endeavor. Rabbi Akiva would be the first to acknowledge that he owed all of his accomplishments to love. He was only able to devote himself to study because his beloved Rachel betrothed herself to him on the condition that he become a scholar. When he accepted her proposal, he simultaneously bound himself to her and to his study of Torah in love. So it's no wonder that Rabbi Akiva is the one who declares the epic love poem in the Bible, Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, the Holy of Holies among all of the sacred writings. In a Talmudic discussion where the rabbis attempt to identify the most important principle in the Torah, Rabbi Akiva, of course, chooses a verse about love. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You should love your neighbor as yourself. According to Rabbi Akiva, the pinnacle of wisdom in our Torah, the principle most essential, is not captured in a verse about God or prayer or the mitzvot. No, it's a verse that commands us to love one another. By sincerely loving each other, we would fulfill all of our other sacred obligations. Rabbi Akiva was basically telling us what the prophets John Lennon and Paul McCartney would later make famous. All you need is love. Akiva's Torah is bold and audacious. Where others saw despair, Akiva found hope. When others were afraid, Akiva summoned strength. And when others felt abandoned, Akiva clung to love. As with any powerful thing, though, love can also be dangerous. It can consume us, distorting into an unhealthy obsession or even fanaticism. Unfortunately, Akiva's love, the quality of his which made him so great, is also perhaps the fatal flaw that led to his gruesome demise. Rabbi Akiva was born around 50 CE, and he would have been a young man when Rome conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the Second Temple. That catastrophe shaped his life and his mind and his world. But in spite of the devastating defeat, Akiva never gave up hope that Jewish sovereignty would return as soon as the people repented for their sins. Akiva was, of course, basing his hope on the teachings of the Torah, which state over and over that if we violate our covenant with God, God will use our enemies to punish us and exile us from our land. But if and when we have sufficiently repented, God will send us a Messiah, an anointed one, a political leader who will reestablish Jewish sovereignty. This promise had seemingly already been fulfilled in the past after the destruction of the first temple. The exiled Jews in Babylonia were permitted to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the Mikdash about 70 years after it was destroyed. So, about 70 years after the destruction of the second temple, Rabbi Akiva was eager to spot the signs that God had forgiven us and would restore us to our former glory. And perhaps this is why Rabbi Akiva was so convinced that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. We don't know much about him, but we do know that Bar Kokhba was a charismatic and talented military leader committed to the cause of Jewish liberation. With Akiva's support, Bar Kokhba grew in popularity and strength as people rallied behind his ill-fated rebellion against Rome. Among his dedicated and doomed soldiers were Akiva's 24,000 students. I can only imagine what it was like when Rabbi Akiva was told that Bar Kokhba had fallen in battle. The kind of devastation he must have felt, the guilt, the regret, the agonizing responsibility. Akiva had gambled and he had lost everything. It was worse, actually. Bar Kokhba's defeat led to an even more ruthless Roman rule, ruining any possibility for establishing Jewish sovereignty in Akiva's lifetime. The Romans would no longer turn a blind eye, allowing harmless Jewish practices to go unpunished. Instead, any minor violation of their anti-Jewish policies would result in the harshest, most brutal punishment. Rabbi Akiva had been a shepherd who had unknowingly led his sheep to the slaughter, catastrophically failing them in his duty to protect them. And I have to wonder what impact this had on his relationship with God, his shepherd that he had trusted to shield and guide him. So maybe Rabbi Akiva thought he had nothing else to lose. Or maybe he felt he should have died on the battlefield led by his Messiah and fighting alongside his students. Or maybe he wanted the Roman authorities to punish him, to expiate his sins the way God used Israel's enemies to compel them to repent. Perhaps that is why he provoked the Roman authorities, giving them no choice but to arrest and to execute him. Akiva understood the risks when he continued to teach Torah publicly. A childhood friend of his, Papas ben Yehuda, cautioned him to stop this dangerous endeavor, but he refused. Rabbi Akiva explained his reasoning with a parable. To what can this be compared? It's like a fox walking along a riverbank, and when he sees fish gathering and fleeing from place to place, he asks them, "From where are you fleeing?" They answered him, "We are fleeing from the nets that people cast upon us." And he said to them, "Do you wish to come up onto dry land, and we will live together side by side, just as my ancestors lived with your ancestors?" The fish replied to the fox, "You are the one who is called the cleverest animal of all. You are not clever. You are a fool. If we are afraid in the water, our natural habitat which gives us life, all the more so should we fear a hostile habitat in which we have no chance of surviving. No thanks, we would rather take our chances in the water." Rabbi Akiva concluded, "So it is now with us that as Jews we must learn and teach Torah as it's written, for through that you shall have life and shall long endure. If we were to abandon Torah and its study, it would be tantamount to abandoning our natural habitat and lead to our certain death." For Akiva, Torah was his life. It was the air he breathed. He had sacrificed everything for it. To abandon it now would be to betray his very being, and it would mean admitting that everything he had ever done, all of his learning and teaching and success, every sacrifice and every person who died because of him, it would all be in vain. If he were to try to evade death by capitulating to the Romans and renouncing Judaism, he might as well not continue to live at all. A few days after Pappos ben Yehuda warned Rabbi Akiva to stop teaching Torah publicly, the Romans arrested Akiva and threw him in prison. To his surprise, the Romans also arrested Pappos ben Yehuda and incarcerated him alongside Rabbi Akiva. Akiva asked Pappos, "Why were you brought here?" And Pappos replied, "Happy are you, Rabbi Akiva, for you were arrested on the charge of engaging in Torah. But woe unto me, unto Pappos, who was seized on the charge of engaging in idle pursuits." Ultimately, it didn't matter. Defiantly teaching Torah or desperately trying to transform yourself from a Jew to a proper Roman citizen, either option would lead to the same result: death. Dry land would provide no refuge. The fishermen's nets were too treacherous to avoid. Better to die a fish and not an imposter cosplaying as a fox. The Romans made an example of Rabbi Akiva, subjecting him to an agonizing death. They raked his skin with iron combs, tearing his flesh from his body, and then they tied him to a stake and they burned him alive. As the Romans were torturing him and lighting the flames for his execution, Rabbi Akiva recited the familiar words that appear in today's Parsha, Vaethanan, the words of Shema. A few of his remaining students witnessing this gruesome scene asked Rabbi Akiva, "Our beloved teacher, how can you recite the Shema now as you suffer?" He said to them, "All my days I have been troubled by this verse. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha u'v'chol nafshecha u'v'chol me'odecha. You shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." With all your soul, meaning even as God takes your soul. In the past, I said to myself, when will the opportunity be afforded me to fulfill this verse? Now that it has been granted to me, shall I not fulfill it? As his soul left his body, Rabbi Akiva prolonged his recitation of the Shema, lingering on the word echad, one. A divine voice descended from heaven and said, "Happy are you, Rabbi Akiva, that your soul left your body as you uttered echad, one." I am haunted by this story for so many reasons. I'm disturbed by the violence, the cruelty, the devastating loss, but it's Rabbi Akiva's final teaching on love that I think is most unsettling. That loving God with all your soul necessarily requires a pious person to sacrifice themselves as a martyr. There can be a sort of noble fantasy and almost romantic allure in martyrdom, but I can only see it as dangerous. Think about the billions of people who've been killed because someone believed that their God desired their honorable deaths and the deaths of others more than that God wanted them all to live. When Akiva justifies his flagrant defiance of Roman law to Pappos ben Yehuda, he partially quotes a verse from Deuteronomy. He says, "For through that," and he implies that means teaching Torah, "you shall have life and shall long endure." Akiva knowingly omits the larger context of this statement. In full, we read this: "I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life." if you and your offspring would live by loving Adonai your God, heeding God's command, and holding fast to God. For through that you shall have life and shall long endure upon the soil that Adonai swore to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Choose life, we are told, through loving God. These questions about identity and safety have plagued me relentlessly over the past 10 months. I found myself debating whether or not to tell the cab driver to drop me a block away from the synagogue and then walk the rest. Or to say, I'm a teacher, when that stranger I'm chatting with in line for coffee asks me, what do I do for work? I've been wondering if I would have raised my hand on the subway car when an angry mob of protesters demanded Zionists identify themselves, threatening that this was their last chance to escape. Does that make me a coward? Does that make me a bad Jew, a bad rabbi? Am I a fish who will inevitably be caught by a net? Or am I a fish who chooses to suffocate on dry land trying to escape the fishermen? Or maybe, just maybe, is it possible that I'm a fish who recognizes those aren't my only options? That choosing one brutal death over another is actually no choice at all? And besides, who is more of an expert of surviving in the water? The fisherman, the fox, or the fish? Why would I allow these land creatures to determine my fate when I am swimming in an ocean of possibilities? Forget the men, forget the fox. Let's find ourselves a fish who can help us navigate these dangerous waters. I would like to introduce you to someone. It is unlikely that you've heard of her, but in these matters, I assure you she is an expert. Branca Diaz was born in Portugal in 1515, and when she was only 21 years old, Portugal followed Spain's example and established their own office at the Inquisition. The Inquisitor would continue on in some form or another until 1821, just 4 years before the founding of our synagogue. No one was safe from the Inquisitor. Branca, along with practically every Jewish person in her town, converted to Christianity to protect themselves. In public, Branca masqueraded as a Christian, but in secret, she was steadfast in her Jewish practice, becoming a hidden or crypto-Jew. Her husband, Diogo Fernandes, fled to Brazil to escape the Inquisitor. He left his wife and 7 children. He sought a secure and safe place for them in the colony that Portugal had just established a few decades before. But within 2 years of his departure, Branca was arrested by the Inquisitor. Out of sheer desperation, her sister and her mother had given her name to the Holy Office in hopes of receiving leniency for themselves. She spent 2 years in prison while her 7 children were left to provide for themselves. But Branca Diaz negotiated her release. She agreed to 2 conditions: that she renounce Judaism and she remain in Portugal. Pretty immediately, though, she defied both. We don't know for sure, but most likely Branca fled Portugal with her 7 children, stowing away on a ship and bribing the captain with jewelry for safe passage. When she landed in Brazil in 1551, Branca Diaz became the first Jewish woman to have ever stepped foot in the Americas. And you've never heard her name. Literally everything that she did for the rest of her life is an historic achievement. Dayenu, it would have been enough for Branca to have accomplished just this. But she wasn't one to rest on her laurels. Shortly after she arrived, Branca and Diogo established themselves as stewards of the crypto-Jewish community in the area surrounding their town of Olinda. They created and maintained 2 clandestine synagogues, and they invited everyone to celebrate the Jewish holidays in their own home. Branka eventually opened a school for Jewish girls where she instructed them on the fundamentals of keeping a Jewish household and, importantly, keeping that Jewish household hidden. This woman was brilliant. I want to give you a few examples of the clever ways she maintained Jewish life without risking her own death. On her house, which I visited on my trip to Brazil earlier this year, above her front door is a unique decoration. Is it a scroll? Is it tablets? Are those tassels seats? You know, it isn't Jewish, but it feels Jewish. In her backyard was a pool, just a pool, which coincidentally had all of the same characteristics of a mikveh. And, every year in the fall, her students dressed in long white dresses, their skirts hiding palm fronds that they had tied to their ankles. And then they would sing as they danced in a circle, shaking their feet in every direction. Surely, it was just by chance that this quirky little tradition always happened during Sukkot. Of the 11 children that she would mother, 2 of them had disabilities. Her daughter, Britas, had a mental disability and an exaggerated curve in her spine, limiting her mobility. Branka nurtured her and loved her and patiently instructed her alongside her other students. Her son, Manuel Afonso, was born without arms. Branka devised a method and taught him how to write with his toes. Now, don't forget, this is the 16th century when only about 15 to 20% of adults could read and write. 100% of Branka's children could. The Inquisitor arrived in Brazil in 1593, and Branka's infamous reputation as the barely hidden crypto Jew, of course, reached his office. He was furious with her brazen defiance, not only to have escaped punishment in Portugal, but also to have flagrantly flouted the Inquisitor's anti-Jewish laws here in Brazil. And he finally captured her and brought her back to Portugal to be burned for her crimes. But Branka didn't mind. At that point, she had already been dead for a couple of decades. Shortly after, the Dutch would conquer a piece of land in Brazil right next to Branka's town of Olinda. Some of the Spanish-Portuguese Jews who had fled to Amsterdam when the Inquisition forced them into exile now sailed to Brazil to establish a Dutch trading post and to finally be able to live without fear of being persecuted for their Jewish identities. Imagine that. They founded a town which they named Recife. In 1636, like Branca Diaz had done secretly almost a century before, they opened Kahal Tzur Yisrael, a synagogue with a school and a mikveh. That was when Kahal Tzur Yisrael became the official first synagogue in the Americas, though we know that Branca Diaz did it much earlier. Recife and the Jewish community there would flourish for a brief period of time under the liberal laws of the Dutch before the Portuguese ultimately drove them out and reinstated their ruthless inquisitor in 1654. The inquisitor had the synagogue destroyed, trying to erase any evidence of Jewish existence. He built a church where it had once stood, and then he hunted the Jews who remained in Brazil. Some of them would flee back to Amsterdam. Others would escape to the wilderness in the interior of the country or to the nearby Caribbean islands. But 23 of those brave, resilient, determined, proud Jews boarded a ship and sailed to the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. In 1655, they established the very first synagogue in what would become New York City and called it Shareth Israel. And in 1825, a small group of congregants decided to leave Shareth Israel to create our community, B'nai Jeshurun, the second synagogue in New York City and the first Ashkenazi synagogue here. It is their legacy that we will celebrate this year during our bicentennial. In 2002, the synagogue in Recife was rebuilt on its original site, and earlier this year I had the incredible honor to officiate at a bar mitzvah in that historic and sacred place. 369 years after the Inquisitor tried to eradicate Jewish life in Brazil, we celebrated Jewish joy. So tell me, isn't this story unbelievable, right? I mean, I'm in awe of our ancestors, their perseverance, their determination, their will to live, to survive. And of course, Branca Diaz, come on, can you get better? She was brave, strategic, and incredibly smart. She figured out how to thread the needle, successfully evading those who hunted her without abandoning the essence of her Jewish identity. And more than that, she taught the children. Rabbi Akiva might have perceived himself as fulfilling the mitzvah of loving God with all of his soul through his martyrdom. But Branca definitely fulfilled the mitzvah stated later in that paragraph, Vishinantam levanecha, the mitzvah of diligently teaching Torah to the next generation, ensuring its survival for at least another few decades. A divine voice never appeared to grant Branca eternal life, but thousands upon thousands of Brazilian Jews can trace their lineage to her, either biologically or as a descendant of one of her students. Branca Diaz wasn't a shepherd, she wasn't a rabbi, she was a mother and a teacher. Almost no one remembers who she was, but nevertheless, her Torah endures, and I think she has a lesson for us. We don't have to resign ourselves to being captured in the fisherman's nets or suffocating on dry land. We will not choose either death. Instead, we choose life, a life in which we wildly and recklessly love ourselves and each other, and especially our children, because then, and only then, will we know how to love God with all our soul. Shabbat Shalom.